Well, good morning, everyone. So good to see you. It's 2008, and I've just finished with seminary, and my wife and I look at each other and we go, there's still some other experiences we want to have. I hadn't learned everything I wanted to learn, so we moved to Jerusalem, and our 10-month-old was our oldest at the time, obviously came along with us, and I got to study for a year at a really amazing place called Jerusalem University College. And one of my professors there is an ordained Jewish rabbi who had spent his life's work on what's called classical rabbinic literature. So it's Mishnah, Talmuds, Tosefta, all the earliest Jewish work. And one of the things that I learned was that from the time of Jesus and a few hundred years after, that there are more than 4,000 parables preserved in classical rabbinic literature. Jesus didn't invent the parable, he perfected the parable. And my rabbi teacher is not a Messianic Jew, meaning he doesn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, Son of God, and all of that, but has become a dear friend over the years. And I remember on one occasion that while we were talking about the parables, he said this in our class. He said, listen, I don't have the same belief that you all have in Jesus, but here's what I can tell you, is that when you look at all of the parables among the rabbis from around the time of Jesus, none of the other rabbis can hold a candle to the types of stories that Jesus told. He said his parables are unbelievable. They are sophisticated, they are layered, they are phenomenal. And that's something that we've gotten to see throughout this series, throughout the summer, is just how brilliant of a storyteller Jesus was and is. And it also just allows us to enter in deeply to see all of the layers and what was going on in Jesus' day and how he was bringing all of this together to create and share these timeless truths. So I get the joy this morning to take us into the parable of the workers in the vineyard. It's from Matthew chapter 20. It's the only place that this parable shows up, and it is absolutely astounding. Now, here's what I want to do, is that when it comes to parables, parables aren't meant just to be read or heard. They're meant to be engaged, to be experienced. And so in order to help us get into this parable, there are two settings within the parable. There is the marketplace, and then there is a vineyard. And let me show you a photo here of a vineyard from the first century world. And this is in the Galilee region. Maybe, oh, there it is. All right, fantastic. This is in Galilee. Okay, so first century world, meaning this is kind of what the look and feel would have been. This is in the Galilee today. And because we're dealing with both a marketplace and a vineyard, I wanted to give you the vineyard because the climactic moment happens in the vineyard. Now, here's what I want you to do as well, is that I want you not just to kind of see the story, but to get inside the story. And so I want you to pretend that you're one of these day laborers. So this is a very common scene in Jesus' day, is that you have people who would go to the marketplace early in the morning with the hope that they were going to get hired for the day, and you needed a denarius a day to take care of the basic needs of your family. Now, this setting would have been familiar to Jesus' audience because under the weight of the taxation that the Jewish people were under in the first century world, many of them had lost their fields, their orchards, their vineyards. From best that we can estimate from the taxes they gave to the Jewish temple, which were minimal, but bigger than that to Rome, who was ruling the world and occupying the land, the people in Jesus' day paid taxes anywhere from 50 to 80%. Yeah, you thought your tax bracket was bad. And so people are losing their farms, and now they are trying to get hired on as day laborers, and many of them are actually working the fields they used to own. And so they're going into the marketplace, and I want you to imagine that that is you, hoping that you get hired. And here's the other thing you need to know about the parable before we engage it, is that the way the day worked, the work day, was roughly 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And so when they talk about in the parable early in the morning, think right around sunrise, 6 a.m., and then you're going to hear third hour, which is 9 a.m., sixth hour, noon, ninth hour, 3, 11th hour, 5. Okay, you all get that. It's a 12-hour workday. All right, so with all of that in mind, I'd like to invite you to please stand, and if you can't physically stand, please stand in your heart. And I want you just to hear this parable as if you were this audience in the first century world, and to go a step deeper, that you are one of these day laborers who are going out to the marketplace early in the morning. So here's the story Jesus told. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He said, I will pay you a denarius for your work, and then he sent them into the vineyard. About the third hour, he went out again and saw others standing around in the marketplace. He said, you also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. He went out again at about the 6th and the 9th hours and did the same thing. About the 11th hour, he went out and still found others standing around. And he asked them, why have you been standing here all day doing nothing? And they replied, because no one has hired us. And he said, you also go and work in my vineyard. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the ones hired last and going on to the first. The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came, and each received a denarius. So when those who were hired first came, they were expecting to receive more, but they also each received a denarius. Now, when they received this, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last only worked 1 hour, and yet you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. To which the owner replied to one of them, friend, I am not being unfair to you. Did you not agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give to the ones hired last the same that I gave to those who were hired first. And don't I have a right to do what I want with my own money? Or is your eye evil because I am good? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Thank you. Now, when you hear this story and you hear about this landowner who keeps going out throughout the day, like, I don't know about you, but a number of questions begin to arise within me. Now, let me just walk you through a number of questions that just come to the front for me. First is this: why does the landowner make so many trips to the marketplace to hire day laborers? Like, why doesn't he hire them all in the first hour? Did he miscalculate his needs for the day? Thank you. And why would he trouble himself by going back to the marketplace and hiring workers for only 1 hour of work? Was the work that important that he had to hire more workers for that last hour? And why were their laborers still in the marketplace at the 11th hour? If they hadn't been hired up to this point, why hadn't they gone home? Like, what were they still doing there? Okay, interview with me on this story. Yes, like you hear this and you go, okay, what in the world is going on with the multiple trips to the marketplace? Well, this is part of the brilliance of Jesus, this master storyteller, is that this is something that master storytellers would include in their parables. Now, if we just step back for a moment and we think about, okay, what were the parables' point? Like 1/3 of Jesus' teachings are in the form of parables. What are they trying to accomplish? Well, when it comes to parables, they illustrate, clarify, or emphasize a principle point or idea. So there's generally one big overarching theme to each parable. And what happens is that when it comes to the parables, they're drawn from everyday experiences. It's common, everyday, ordinary events. But what happens is that the storyteller will add in some pieces or overemphasize some things or embellish some things in order to make that clarifying point crystal clear, and also come at a moment after all of this tension has been built, because those are the best stories. Those are the ones that we remember. And so what I want to do is I just want to walk through the parable, each part relatively quickly, just to highlight some additional backdrop information that helps you to see what is going on in this parable as we work our way to this climactic moment to understand what is this point that Jesus was trying to make. So it begins here with, for the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner. Now, real quick, kingdom of heaven, this is language that has been all over the parables. And earlier on this summer, when I had the opportunity to talk about the parable of the mustard seed, we defined what the kingdom of heaven was. And here's just the summary of it. It's the rule and reign of God advancing here on earth, bringing healing and wholeness by pushing out the chaos, the brokenness, the pain of the world. So that when Jesus shows up on the scene and he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, it's that God's will and God's way is happening through the life and ministry of Jesus, and people's lives are being changed. But what's more is that Jesus just hasn't come to declare the kingdom of heaven. He's actually training disciples to partner with him in this endeavor, and that's what's going on in this passage. In fact, within Matthew 20, where this parable is, it's a conversation about discipleship. And the kingdom of heaven was also the name of Jesus' movement. So when he begins by saying, for the kingdom of heaven is like, it's like, okay, Jesus is saying, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to claim to be a disciple of mine, then what this story is talking about is something that you should embody in your own lives. So the audience is anticipating, what are we to draw on this? What are we to learn from this about what it means to follow Jesus and to partner with God in what God is doing in the world today? So for the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning, so break of dawn, 6 a.m. or so, to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day. Here is a picture of a denarius. It's a silver coin, and it was the compensation for a day's work for a day laborer. And it was just enough for them to have their basic needs met. And so the landowner agrees to pay them a denarius for the day. About the third hour, so 9 a.m., he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you a denarius? No, I will pay you whatever is right. That's a huge moment in this parable, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. So then he went out again about the 6th and the 9th hour and did the same thing. So even though this scene of workers needing to be hired for the day, being in the marketplace, was common, what's uncommon is the owner going out multiple times during the day. That's something Jesus has added in here to build tension, to increase the stakes, to get us to that climactic moment. And then we find out 6th being noon, 9th being 3, and then we come to the 11th hour. Went out 5 p.m. and found still others standing around. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day doing nothing? No one has hired us, they answered. And he said, you also go and work in my vineyard. Now, even though Jesus has added in this, the owner going out so many times during the day, this scene would have struck a chord of absolute realism to Jesus' audience. That people were so desperate to get even a denarius to take care of their basic needs that they would stand around hoping that someone would hire them, even if it was only for an hour's worth of work. They would have caught this. And so Jesus tells us, and then we got that when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his supervisor, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first. Now, here's something else really cool about not only Jesus's teachings, but his stories as well, is that he is constantly pulling from the Hebrew scriptures. That's his Bible. That's the Bible of his audience. And so when Jesus is telling these stories, you always want to ask yourself, is he drawing on something from the Hebrew scriptures? And the answer to that about 95% of the time is yes. You just got to then figure out what's going on. Now, this part is actually part of Jewish law, and it goes back to Deuteronomy 24, 14 to 15. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy. So there's your context, poor and needy. Whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns, pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. So when the landowner does this at the end of the day, let me go back here. When it comes to the end of the day, everybody would have go, okay, this is a righteous man. This is what you are supposed to do. That was expected. It's this last part that wasn't expected, beginning with the ones who were hired last and going to the first. Now, again, this is part of Jesus crafting this climactic scene that is coming, because here's the deal, is that if the supervisor or the foreman would have paid the ones first who were hired first, they wouldn't have been around to see what the last ones got. And that would have ruined the story. Now, they would have heard about it, but Jesus is crafting this scene that is to come. And so then we read, absolutely astounding, the workers who were hired about the 11th hour came and each received a denarius. I mean, the jaw of Jesus' audience would have just dropped, going, wow, what amazing generosity that this landowner has. And if that's what those who are hired last got, I wonder what those who are hired first are going to get. Exactly what those first ones hired were thinking as well. So when those who came or were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. Now, I don't know about you, but when you come to this moment in the story, you kind of feel like they're justified in this, don't you? Of course we do. You know why? Because when we engage in this parable, typically what I have found is that people never associate with themselves who were hired at the 11th hour. We all want to believe we were hired first and deserving of the day's work. And yet, Jesus puts this on the landowner, where the landowner gives them each a denarius, and they're upset. And so what's the response of the landowner? Friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or is your eye evil because I am good? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Now, when you're trying to unlock this parable and really kind of get the full effect of this climactic moment that takes place in the vineyard, what we need to understand is this line, or is your eye evil because I am good? Now, let's just begin with good for a few moments. Is that when it comes to this word good, if you were reading all of Matthew, you would know that in the previous chapter, Matthew 19, Jesus is having a conversation with a guy that we call the rich young ruler. Okay, many of you know this story. And in the dialogue Jesus has with him, he says to the rich young ruler, only God is good. Same word here. So now when we hear that the landowner says that I am good, we're starting to go, oh, this landowner is representing the essence of what God is like. What's more, to a first century audience, any story told in connection to a vineyard would send their minds back to a really critical passage in Isaiah chapter 5. It's called the Song of the Vineyard, and it's a passage about how God engages with his people as in a vineyard. So when Jesus talks about vineyards and he employs vineyard language, God is always connected to it. So that's the good part, but there's another level to the good, but in order to understand that, we have to understand this phrase, evil eye. Now, when you hear evil eye, like you think an evil eye, right? And you go, what is Jesus talking about? He doesn't say evil eyes, he says evil eye singular. And you go, is Jesus referring to a physical eye here, or is there something more going on with this phrase? It's the latter, okay? It's actually an idiomatic expression that everybody knew in Jesus' day. And in order to understand what that is, we have to go looking for it again in the Hebrew Scriptures. So Deuteronomy 15, verses 7 through 8, if there is a poor person among you, are you catching the theme here, by the way? I mean, it's so brilliant how Jesus keeps bringing this back into the story. If there is a poor person among you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall fully open your hand to him and generously lend him enough for his need in whatever he lacks. So the idea of being open-handed is to be generous. Notice how it goes on in the next verse. Be careful that there is no mean spirit thought in your heart, such as the 7th year, the year of release of debts is near, and your eye is evil toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry out to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. To be open-handed is to be generous. To be close-handed or close-fisted is to be stingy. Now, notice how this gets fleshed out in the wisdom literature found in Proverbs. So Proverbs 22:9, whoever has a good eye will be blessed, for they share their bread with the poor. Same theme, right? Generosity, giving to those who have needs. And then check out Proverbs 28:22. A person with an evil eye hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon them. Now, what this proverb is tapping into is it's not just about stinginess, it's about a sense of jealousy or envy that someone with an evil eye has. That's why it says poverty will come upon them, because they're going to be seeing what they don't have, and they're going to put their time and their energy and their resources in trying to acquire that. That's why poverty is going to come, is because they're going to keep acquiring until they have nothing left to purchase, and therefore, if anybody does have a need, they're going to be close-fisted because they don't have the resources to generously give to someone else, and they will be stingy as a result of having an evil eye. Okay, does that make sense right there? Now you go, okay, well, that's amazing that that's in Deuteronomy. That's amazing in the Proverbs. How do we know that this was common language in Jesus' day? Well, this is where other archaeological finds help solidify what's unfolding. Now, at a place called Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, this is just off the northeast corner of the Dead Sea, you have all of these different caves that the scrolls were found in. This is probably the most famous one because it's what's on everybody's postcards and book covers and everything. The one that you can see right here is Cave 4. And I just love the whole structure here because it actually looks like a stormtrooper's helmet right there, all right? And when they were excavating and finding the Dead Sea Scrolls in cave 4 here, they found a fragment, and on the fragment it read this: "Do not entrust your wealth to a man with an evil eye." And this dates to the time of Jesus. So all of a sudden you're tapping into what this parable is all about. And when it says, "Or is your eye evil because I am good?" many of your translations have already done the work for you. And that is good. The only issue with that is that if you don't know what the phrase is, then you can't trace where it's coming from, and you miss the larger context in which it was derived in order to help bring it to a fuller understanding what that present moment is. So many of your translations will say this: "Or are you envious because I am generous?" That's the contrast that is going on here. Now, one more piece to this puzzle, and then let's start putting things together. I mentioned earlier on that we were going to come back to the owner's response to those hired at the third hour and what we find out afterwards. "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." Doesn't say denarius, it says whatever is right. Now, the word right here is the word dikaios. Let me hear you say dikaios. Dikaios is Greek, and Matthew was originally recorded, or at least found, in Greek. Jesus would have not taught in Greek. He would have taught in Hebrew or Aramaic, depending upon the scholarly debates and discussions. But the whole idea here is that this is a theme that people knew well. This is, again, part of their common everyday conversations. So this word dikaios means upright, just, or righteous. And it's connected to this word righteousness, which in many ways has a negative connotation at times. Like you go, "Oh, that person, is so righteous," or, who thinks, they should be that righteous? The other way that sometimes righteousness is discussed is it's all about right behavior. And that's true, but there's a larger context to it. And it's always fascinating that the word righteousness in the Older Testament is paired with this word justice. So tzedakah and mishpat. And the word righteousness means the standard of being in right relationship. That's what this is why in Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6 will say, "Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness." Why? Because the essence of the kingdom is duplicated, if you will, in this word righteousness. It's just saying the same thing twice. It's all about being in right relationship. So when God created the world, there's 4 relationships that he created. There's a relationship we have with God, there's a relationship we have with one another, there's a relationship we have with ourselves, and there's a relationship we have with creation. And when Adam and Eve take from the tree and the goodness, the shalom of God's world is shattered, those relationships are broken. And the rest of the scripture stories about how is God restoring relationship, because life is relationship. When Jesus was asked, "What's the greatest commandment?" he said, "You love God and you love your neighbor," right? It's this whole working of relationship. So when it comes to this word justice, justice in the Bible means the actions taken to restore righteousness and to prevent any future injustice. And this is legal justice. This is also social justice. And the idea is that for justice to reign supreme, people need to have their basic needs met. That's part of just the social justice side of things. Justice is much bigger than social justice, but there is this sense that everybody has their basic needs met. So now think again about this parable, where the landowner goes into the marketplace early in the morning and says, "I will pay you a denarius for the day." And they say, "Great." And then he goes back later, and it's not a full day's work for the one hired at the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, and the 11th hour. And yet the owner gives them a denarius as well to take care of their basic needs. You recognize this is a parable about justice through generosity. That this embodies the heart of God when it comes to how we interact with other people. And the whole point of Jesus going, okay, he went out in the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th, and 11th, and then paid the 11th hour ones the same as the 1st hour ones. You go, that doesn't seem fair. Exactly. God isn't fair by the world's standards, but he's not unfair. The landowner says, I have not been unfair to you. This is what we agreed to. This is what I have paid you. And I bless God every day, and I'm sure you do as well, that God doesn't treat us the way we should be treated, that God isn't fair towards us. This is the essence of grace, right? For the wages of sin is death. The whole gospel message is about how God generously gave to us when we didn't deserve it. And that as we experience God's generosity in our lives, it should now work through us as we are generous to other people to a point that the rest of the world would say, yeah, that doesn't seem fair. And you go, yep, just like our God. And if you've been around the movement of Jesus, a follower of Jesus for any length of time, you know that central to the gospel message is generosity. Like we are called to be radically generous. So that's not new information. But Jesus still tells this story in a way to get at some things that I believe prevents us from being generous at the level with which this landowner was in this story. And so I just want to spend the rest of our time trying to get a sense for answering this question. What prevents us from being generous? And many of you know that my family and I came to Middle Tennessee from West Michigan. We came from a town called Holland, Dutchville, Tulip Time Festival. Some of you know about that. It's the land of either you're Dutch or you're not, right? You ain't much if you ain't Dutch. And if any of you are Dutch in here, I'm with you. I have part of a Dutch heritage, so I'm not ripping on Dutch people. I'm just saying what is just everybody understands to be true, all right? And being in West Michigan, we moved here about 4.5 years ago. But what we would do when we lived in West Michigan is that we would go typically end of September, maybe the first part of October, to a little city called Fenville. And in Fenville was Crane's apple orchard. All right, apple picking. This was a big deal in West Michigan. And we had it on our calendar. And so we would go to Crane's apple orchard, and we would arrive, and we had a singular focus. We knew what apple we were going to get, not different types of apples, an apple. We went for one apple. Because from our family's perspective, you go to a place like this and you see all these different apples. You can have your Ida Reds, you can have your Empires, you can have your Goldens, you can have your Jonathans, you can get fancy and have your Jonna Golds. But as for me and my house, Honeycrisp. You with me? Candy disguised as an apple, right? And so we would go and we would just fill bags of Honeycrisp apples. And it was always so fun for our kids to be able to go. And I remember distinctively this one year. So we've got 4 kids, 13, 11, 9, and 6. At the time, my oldest Denian was 6 years old. My daughter Araya was 4. And then Calix was 2. And Zyler, his surprise wasn't on the way yet, all right? And so we went and we picked these apples and we got back. And you know the whole mantra, an apple a day keeps the doctor away? Like in this season, our mantra was like 5 apples a day keeps the doctor away. And so I remember getting home and Denian, 6 years old, goes, Dad, I want an apple. And so I went and got him an apple and I gave it to him. And he sat down at the dining room table and it was just like this utter joy, smiling ear to ear. Well, around the corner comes Araya. She's 4, and she says, Daddy, I want an apple as well. And I was like, hold on one moment. So I went out and I got an apple and I gave it to her. And she sat down next to Denyon and just utter joy from ear to ear. And then all of a sudden, unbeknownst to me, my son Denyon let me know that I gave her an apple that was bigger than his. And he came unglued, and it was like he screamed in justice. How could you give her a bigger apple? I want a different apple. I want one that size. And I just remember going, oh my goodness, what is going on? A lack of gratitude. Like, you just had to answer the question, like, what keeps us from generosity? I really believe that it is a lack of gratitude first and foremost. That he is sitting there with complete joy, but the moment someone has something that he doesn't have, his joy is stripped, and his mind is about how can I get that? How many of you've experienced this with your kids with ice cream in the last few weeks at some point? Exactly. It happens all the time. But it's not just kids with apples and ice cream. It's us as well, is it not? Like, our homes are just fine until some newfound friends invite us over for dinner and we see what they have and we go, wow, I live in a dump. Right? Our phone works just fine until the newest model is released. Like, our cars work just fine. They're fantastic until we get a ride in someone's Jeep. Right? We know who was here last week. All right, you just gave yourself away. By the way, I love Jeeps, all right? I don't actually drive a Jeep. I drive a Subaru. Any Subi fans out there? Yes, some of you, all cars have Colts, by the way. But the very first vehicle that I learned how to drive was my dad's 1982 Jeep CJ7. Oh, man, manual transmission. I drive a manual exclusively to this day because I loved his Jeep so much. But it happens with houses and cars and phones and lots of other things that arise in the midst of our daily lives. It's so easy to see something and instead move to a posture of gratitude. We move to a posture of getting. I got to get that. I got to acquire that. And this is why when I talk about that, I think this parable is about, it's about generosity and justice, is because when we are a generous people, and I believe that the foundation of that is gratitude, then we're much more open to what other people need and how God may be speaking to us in order to fulfill that need. But if we aren't grateful for what we have and instead focus on what we don't have, and we try to acquire it, then we spend time and energy and finances trying to do that. And when our focus is on getting and it's not on someone else, then not only do we not have the capacity to see another's need, but even if we do, we may not have, the consciousness to see another need, we may not have the capacity to fill that need. And that's really about jealousy. Like, somebody has something that I don't have and I want to go and get it. But here's the thing for me where it goes even a step deeper is that if we can't acquire it, because there's certain things that we can't get that we would want, we move into something more toxic. And as I was just thinking about this, I was just really clearly recall, it's been almost 7 years, I had the opportunity to publish my first book. And when it was released, it did okay. It didn't do great. It wasn't abysmal. It was somewhere in between. And the same week that my book was released, another author released a book, and that book did really well, like New York Times bestseller. And I remember reading that book and getting done and going, wow, that book is crap. I felt like all they did was distill what everybody's been saying for the last decade, watered it down, and now it hit the New York Times bestsellers list. And I remember as I was so frustrated and jealous, is what it was, that someone else was experiencing success, that I was moving from jealousy into envy. You know what the difference is? Envy is envy because what comes with it is resentment. I began to resent this author who I didn't know. Was the book crap? No, it wasn't. Do I think they still distilled everything everybody else was saying? Yes, but that's another discussion for another day. It helped lots of people. At this point, probably over 1 million people have read this book and have been positively impacted by it. That's great. Fantastic, wonderful. My problem was that I wanted something that they had, and because I couldn't acquire it, I moved from jealousy into envy, and I began to resent that person for the good work and the success they were experiencing, but guess who I was resenting even more? God. Because I felt like I deserved that. And I remember one day in particular where it was like God smacked me upside the head and said, Brad, if you can't celebrate the success of another, especially the kind of success that you wanted, then your heart isn't right. You've got an evil eye. And it was like, yep, that's absolutely true. It was about entitlement, jealousy, envy, and a lack of gratitude. And I think this is the same thing that we wrestle with on a regular basis. I would like to believe that the last time I had that attitude was about 7 years ago. It's not. It's so easy to want what someone else has. And I know that for me, I've had to cultivate the spirit of gratitude. And one of the ways in which, there's 2 things in particular that have been helpful to me that may be helpful to you. One is every morning before I ask God for anything, I write down 2 things that I'm grateful for. Just to start my day grounding myself in gratitude. And the second practice is every single time I complain about something, I immediately on the heels identify something I'm grateful for. And you know what? I've been grateful for a lot of things lately, which tells me I still have a lot of work to do because I'm constantly griping about something. And it's just a way for God to work into my own heart. Because when we're trying to acquire, when we're trying to get, and we're not grateful for what we have, our focus is on the inside. But if we're able to open ourselves up to what others may need, some really beautiful things begin to unfold. That we can be generous, even beyond what we've been generous already. Because gratitude is the engine of generosity. Oh, let's go back for a moment. Gratitude is the engine for generosity. Without gratitude, generosity doesn't have a shot. But when we're grateful and we start looking out, generosity can do some amazing things. And each week we've had the opportunity to listen to someone's story. And I'm so excited for you to listen now to Karen's story as she talks about what God has done in her life and how that impacted someone else. Let's watch this together.
I want people to hear this story because it's a part of my faith journey, and I appreciate the opportunity to share what God has done in my life with the hope that it would spur some action in someone else. to serve in a way that they may not have considered previously. My husband and I met when we were 12 years old, and he's the best. All throughout middle school and high school, I spent time at my future in-laws' home and was welcomed there. When Myers and I entered college, his father, David, was diagnosed with a very rare disease. It required an aggressive treatment, which worked well. And throughout that treatment, we prayed for David and watched him struggle, but eventually get better. As life went on, we were married, graduated college, started our careers, and about 10 years later, David's illness returned. And when it returned the second time, he needed a kidney transplant. Throughout the process of the testing and preparing for the surgery and David's other treatments, again, we continued to pray and watch him throughout the whole process. And unfortunately, David passed away waiting for the treatment. And it was just really devastating for the whole family. And to see that struggle and to see the heartache and not really understand God's plan in that was difficult. And I remember it was 5 years later, in 2015, I was reading through the Bible, and my Bible reading plan had me in the parables, and I was reading the parable of the widow's offering. And what I love about the Bible is the term that we use, that it's God's living word, because it truly is. And we can read the same story over and over and over, and the words don't change, but the message does. And so I was reading the parable of the widow's offering, and it just really struck me in a new way how the widow gave everything. She gave everything that she had, and that was just a way of serving the Lord. And I remember that hit me to the point where I was writing in my Bible, "Go all in," and I really felt this move of the Lord. And that turned out to just be a seed planted. And so I just had this very clear thought that I would have given my kidney to David had I been a match. And there's people in need. Why couldn't I give my kidney to somebody else in need? Why did it need to be a family member? I knew because of how the Lord had worked in my life previously, and I trusted him. I still trust him, and I knew that he would use this for his good. So it wasn't a question of me understanding the calling or what would come of it. It was just a matter of, let's do it. Let's go all in. After all of the testing was completed, my information was put within the registry for those waiting a kidney transplant. Pretty quickly, they found a match for me, and our surgery date was set. I woke up from anesthesia and was told by the nurse that my kidney was able to catch an early flight to New Jersey, which at the time was really exciting to me. That was the story. I went home from the hospital and continued to live my life. I don't know if the recipient knows the Lord. I don't know the greater plan in that story, but I know that I answered God's call. What stood out the most to me was I was able to give a tiny part of myself to someone else that I don't know, and how the intricacy of God's creation allowed for that to happen, but more importantly, the deeper understanding that God gave everything for me and for you and for all of us. He gave his only son to save us, even though we didn't deserve it. And that realization and that deeper understanding is a gift that I will treasure forever. My name is Karen, and this is my story.
Such a great story. Karen, thank you so much for sharing that. And so we're just going to conclude our time with communion. I mean, couldn't say it any better than what Karen just said there. Jesus gave everything. And this is something that I love about our weekly rhythm here, is that we orient ourselves around what Jesus did on our behalf. And the other thing just about Karen sharing her story is that Karen just exudes this joy, and this is a common thing that you see with people who just live with gratitude. Envy, jealousy, entitlement, I mean, that just robs our joy like nothing else. But when we can be grateful for what we have, and out of that be generous, it's like this joy just is part of who we are. and other people benefit as well. And so I don't know how God met you this morning, what the Holy Spirit may be saying to you. But my prayer for all of us is that as we leave here today, that we would figure out a couple of tangible steps on how we can cultivate this gratitude in our lives at maybe a depth and a level that is beyond what we are currently at. And that we would allow God to continue to speak in our lives so that not only do we experience the joy that comes from being grateful and generous, but that others would get what they need as well. So I'd like to ask you to please stand. And on the night before Jesus went to the cross, he took bread. And when he blessed God, he broke the bread and he gave it to his disciples and he said, "Take and eat. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, he took a cup. And when he had blessed God, he gave it to his disciples and he says, "This cup represents the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." And so, God, we just stand as a community here, thanking you for just another opportunity to open up your living word, to allow these stories to leap off the pages into our hearts. And God, we ask now that it would extend out through our hands and through our feet. That God, where we have been living maybe more entitled and jealous and maybe even envy, that God, you would just rescue us from that. That you would allow us to be grounded in gratitude and to be people that are just radically generous in the world. That God, you set the example for us, and we ask that we would carry that example forward. God, we know that these stories of Jesus can at times feel like they sucker punch us. And Jesus, you told really great stories to wake us up so that we would live the best life in tune with what you are asking us to do. So God, if we're walking out of here today feeling a little bit wounded, bring healing through that, but wake us up to where we need to make some changes so that we can experience the health and the wholeness that you desire us to have. God, thank you that your gift of grace and mercy and forgiveness is given without any thought of whether or not it has been earned or deserved. It hasn't. And God, may we be reminded today of the extravagant grace and generosity of you. And may that be something that is true of us as well.